Hello and welcome to another video. So this time around, rather than teaching a particular area, I'm actually going to be running through a resource that's available that can be really helpful when you're kicking off a new project to make things a little bit quicker and easier. So what this is my template Unity project. So this is one where it works with, I've used it for built-in universal high-def pipelines. By default, it's built-in pipeline and using the new input system, but I have used it with the other pipelines as well. So it's a bunch of things. One of the key things is there's a whole set of structure essentially with it. So from the beginning, I've got the sort of core UI flow of having a splash screen that can be displaying a logo. It's got a bit of a loading time there while it's loading the main menu. Main menu has things like we've got a credit screen where we can be putting in details. We also then have a settings screen where it can adjust our different ones. Now, things like the audio settings won't automatically get applied. It stores the value, and so it will remember that, but it doesn't actually save those settings to the audio system. The reason being is that the audio system you're using, you might be using built-in Unity, you might be using something like Fmod or Wwise, so it allows you to easily swap in your own setup there. Graphic settings will get applied over. The camera settings, these are ones that they will get used if you're using the built-in character motor. So built-in character motor will use these. Those will control things like a horizontal and vertical sensitivity there. And we can also control if there is haptic feedback. Now that only supports gamepad currently, but that is something that is available there. So we've got our settings set up, and we can also then go into the main level. And when we go into the main level, we get a fade in. While we're in the main level, we can still access settings. So we've got access to those. We can also go back to the main menu. And so all of those transitions, things like if that are set up in there as well. So this gives us something where we've got a lot of infrastructure already built up there. So I use this for pretty much all of my projects. It gives me that initial structure, so it means right from the get-go I've got stuff where if I want to add in a setting, it's very quick and easy to do that. If I need transitions between levels, that's all already happening, because I found that that's something that can take a chunk of time and is easy to miss. So stuff like the splash screen, it's set up so you can add in a sort of full screen image there that will appear in the background. It has stuff where you can obviously control the different bits of text here. The scene that gets loaded in the background is the main menu, but you can add in a little bit of delay there if you want to have it that the hero image gets seen for a while. So it's all also set up in the build settings. Those scenes are already loaded. It has a bootstrap scene that the settings system uses. So the settings are accessible from anywhere in the project. Easily, that will always be available there. Now, in terms of then looking at stuff like the main menu, structure for that. So third-party middleware-wise, I do use the Fungus add-on, the one that provides visual scripting and a lot of things for narrative side of stuff. Fungus I find really, really helpful and really beneficial. So you'll find it used in things like the main menu. That's handling stuff like the fades, the transitions between the different sections. So our main menu UI, we have all the ones here, so easy to go and modify that if we need to. Settings UI, notice that's a prefab, and when we click on it, there's actually a lot of options here. So this settings system is something I wrote to kind of minimize the need to constantly just lots of setup of code for adding in a new setting. That's a real hassle. I really don't like having to do lots of that. I want to make it simple and easy. So the settings system relies on actually having generated code, and the UI here is actually procedurally generated. So these sections here of the different categories and all of the different elements associated with that, that is actually all procedurally generated. And it also procedurally generates code. So if we go to look at the code for it, one of the key things, so the actual settings all sit in the settings data object. So they're grouped. We have information like metadata for version, and then I've grouped them. So you set up your individual classes under here, and then you can add in your different settings. So there's some attributes that I've set up. So in terms of the different types of settings supported, so it supports just a integer setting, ones that have a string, float, booleans, and then the graphics quality side of things. So these, we can set up our ranges, our defaults, give it categories, names and tooltips, things like that. So there's a lot of different controls there for it. In terms of applying the settings, here is where we can be updating that. All of the different ones, it makes it then really quite easy for adding in new settings. We essentially add in a new entry here. Now, when we add in a new entry here, that means it's going to be able to find it, but then it needs to have the code and the UI linking together. So that's something where, to make this work, easily across different platforms, I don't use reflection at runtime. I use reflection at editor time. So when you do generate UI, and you only want to do that when you open up the prefab and then do generate UI. You don't want to do that in the deactivated prefab here. So when you do that, it uses reflection to find all of the settings. It will generate the appropriate UI for it, but there's also code that it needs to generate. And that code sits in this thing called the settings binder. So this file will actually get updated. It will rewrite the content of this, and things like these enums, this enumeration, all of the entries here essentially in settings binder all get generated procedurally. What that can mean is if you change the name of a setting, if you move things around, stuff like that, you might find that you do initially get code errors and you have to do a manual fix in the settings binder. That's kind of an unavoidable thing, because if I delete a setting that, say I deleted something like the invert y-axis, there's still code in the binder that's referring to it. So I'd need to update the binder manually, because while there's an error, it's not going to be able to properly run the code, so it's not going to be able to regenerate this correctly. So if I was getting errors in the binder, I would manually fix them there, then do the regeneration, and then that's going to give me the UI that I need. So the setting system, it saves it out currently, and if I go to the settings manager, you can see the settings manager, I can just, for anywhere in the code, go settings manager.settings, and that will allow me to access stuff. If I go to in the character motor, you can see accessing those individual ones is quite easy, quite straightforward. So settings manager maintains setting all of those. There's just saved out as a JSON file, so you can manually edit that if you need to. So all of that stuff happens there kind of in the background for us. So setting system, that saves a lot of time. That's something that I found really, really helps out. It does have a couple of things that it will check for if it's on mobile. So there is a couple of little things that it will do differently. So the resolution side of things isn't only going to be present on desktop, because that generally is not applicable on mobile. Quality level will be there regardless, but the actual resolution side of things isn't really applicable on a mobile device, so you won't see that there. So that's our settings side of things. So we've got that. If we go then to the actual main level and take a look there, so main level has our setting stuff, again using Fungus for this. It has this custom character controller that is using the new input system. This custom character controller supports being able to move around, slope limits, being able to jump and crouch, A lot of different options there. If you're interested in seeing the process of building this, that is actually something where I've been doing and I'll be continuing as I identify new things to be adding to it, be adding more things to this controller. There is a series of videos that runs through how the controller works and the design process of how we go about building it stage by stage by stage. So that's something, if you're interested in that, check that out. But this has the current latest version of the controller, so we can figure our heights, radius, the kind of layers that ground corresponds to. It's able to step up on things. We can have slope limits and pitch limits, so in terms of how much we can pitch up or down the camera. We've got controls for our move speed. You can turn off running. There's controls there to make it a little bit more accessible, where the run is a toggle or you hold the key. You can control things like it being able to auto-parent to surfaces. So if you've got a moving controller on a moving platform, auto-parent is something you would generally want to turn on, because that's going to make it that, rather than if the character is here and then the player is sort of the platform would slide under them. If it auto-parents, then when the player is on the platform, they're going to move with the platform. And we've got different auto-parent modes, so it can either auto-parent onto anything, or you can have to particularly tag objects. We've got the crouching support, so we can see things like what our new crouch height is, how that affects speed. So 0.5 means it's going to make it slower. Have controls for falling and air control. So all these things can be turned off and on. It's got stuff for interacting with world space UI, so whether it'll actually send through UI interactions and up to what range, and configuration for the audio side. So there's a lot of options there with the player. It has some specific stuff there for toggling the settings menu, so we can press like an escape to bring up settings, is something that's fully supported in this. That's why when I'm running, I can be looking around, but then if I hit escape, brings this up, and you'll notice it also prevents me from looking around. That's an intentional thing. The character motor has specific stuff in there so that when we're in the menu, it's not going to actually bring that up. And we can also see, if we take a look, again, it's using Fungus for this, when it shows the menu, you can see it also tells our pause manager. So this has built into it, one of the other systems I've got is this pause manager. So it just provides a central point for knowing whether things are paused. It controls whether or not it's going to change 2D physics, 3D, or the timescale. Can have things that get notified. It has different modes, so whether things have to register or not. This, by default, I usually use it in registration mode. And we can see if we go to the character motor, then the character motor, one of the early things that they do is it registers itself with the pause manager. And the character motor specifically says it implements iPausable, which means it gets 4 functions called on it. Pause and resume, do what it says on the tin. So they're functions that will get run when we're pausing, when we are resuming. But we can also control whether or not pausing and resuming is able to happen. So on pause requested, on resume requested, those would allow, if we return false, to inhibit either of those things happening. So that might be something you want to do in a cutscene, or if you're in a particular configuration screen, things like that, you might want to change those settings. Also, this provides us a really easy way for checking if we're currently paused, because we can just from anywhere go, hey, pause manager.isPaused. So that makes that process much, much easier and cleaner for working with. So we've got our general UI structure, we've got our setting system, got our character motor, we've got our pause manager. We've also got a couple of other things. And one of the key things that we've also got is we have this haptics manager. So haptics is referring to sort of feedback, so things like rumbles on a controller. So it's designed for working with the gamepad. It'd be quite easy to adapt it to work for mobile as well. And the test scene gives you the kind of indication of things you can do with it. So we have these little scriptable objects and we can play a haptic effect. that does stuff. So it might be a flat one, it might do a pulse. So we can draw out the different shapes and effects, and then we can play it. We can play it looping or one shot. We can play it at different durations and scales. So that's something that's built in and supported by the Haptics Manager. The other stuff that's integrated there is we can also tell it to integrate with Cinemachine impulses. So Cinemachine has these impulse things, and what they can do is you can use them for stuff like screen shake, but we can also read and respond to those impulses that come in and do other things. So the Haptics Manager, you can enable it to listen for Cinemachine impulses, and if it does receive a Cinemachine impulse, then you can have it make those haptic effects apply. So as soon as you've got those impulses, it'll apply haptic effects, and it handles layering them. That's the big thing the Haptics Manager does, is it can handle layering of the different haptic effects to try and still ensure that you can actually feel the effect. You know, if you've already got ones playing and then you play a different one, so it's able to sort of blend those effects together at any point in time. It also has timeline support. So if I open up timeline, we can do stuff like this. We can play a particular effect, and over a certain duration, we can kick off individual other ones. So if you're making cutscenes, that can be really powerful. It can let you kick off your different haptics very easily, and you're working with a very familiar interface, and the same interface where you're doing other things. You don't need to call out to code to do a haptic effect. You just actually add it into the timeline, which that's something that can save a huge amount of time. So we've got our character stuff, Haptics Manager. There's a couple of little helper things that I've got in here. There's some different stuff for fungus for fading. There's some central stuff for audio that things can run through. There is, and this is a third-party one that I've put the link in here for the GitHub. So this allows you to have conditional field attributes. So it means that you can have a particular setting be visible in the inspector based upon some other value, which can be really handy for hiding and showing different things. So really quite useful there. There's also a couple of other third-party ones, again, stuff for nesting animation clips, and for also being able to nest stuff will replace prefabs in a scene. So there's a couple of little helper ones there that are third-party ones that other people have created that they made available, and so they're included in this as well. So if you're using those, to make sure you're referencing those properly as well. There's a couple of other little things with main menus and minor helpers there. The other sort of big thing that I've got in here is this also has my developer console. So developer console, and if I go to the tutorials, that's probably the easiest one to indicate it. So developer console allows us to, we have something where compress tilde while the game's running. Can type in commands and it has autocomplete. The tutorials are something worth looking at because they walk you through all of sort of the key functions that are there. So we can see it has a lot of different ones. We can be, adding a component onto something. We can be working a little bit with player preferences. We can destroy an object. We can get locations of things. We can set locations. There's also some generic get and set value things. So it has reflection support and support for a range of the common data types of, so that allows us to be able to set particular parameters on something. So we've got a lot of different ones that we can be working here. You can invoke functions. So key stuff there that makes it really handy. And that developer console, something where you just add in the prefab. So it's just a prefab that you add in. You can adjust what keys it listens to for things like bringing that up, for being able to autocomplete and move forward and backwards in the autocomplete history. So it does keep a history within a session. So lots of different ones that you can be doing there with it. You can also detect when that dev console is brought up. So if you wanted to do things like pause user input, very easy to do that. If you're wanting to add in your own commands, that's something that's quite straightforward. If we take a look at the built-in commands, they're quite simple. So they use an attribute to indicate the naming information for the command, and also then some key functions that you implement. So generally, if you're wanting to set up your own commands, that's something where I'd find an existing command that's quite similar, and then you would be able to take that command, modify it, and have that do what you need. You can see the kind of stuff being used for the autocomplete. That includes, there's some ones where it might be doing things like grabbing objects that are in the scene or components there. So there's a bunch of things you can do with the autocomplete on that side that works quite well with it. So that's sort of the key things that we've got available for all of this. This is something where, as I said, you're freely able to be using this in any of your own projects. What I would generally recommend is how I use this is because I always have it in the repo, I fork that. That way then if there's upstream changes I make, I can easily bring those down, and then I've got that forked version that I can then update. I can change and customize it for each particular project. So, you're going to need to go in and build settings if you add in additional scenes. Player settings, you're going to want to set things like your names, your versions there, update stuff in the main menu. And it's something where using a template project, there's always advantages and disadvantages. One of the big advantages is you get a huge amount of stuff just there from the start, so it makes it quicker and easier to get up and running with it. Downside is that if you don't customize stuff, that things are going to all tend to look very much the same. So I've tried particularly with UI things, to have everything prefabbed. So you'll notice with the setting system that all of the bits of UI, the different elements, each of those are their own little prefabs. So you can modify those prefabs so that you can get things looking and feeling the way that you want to for your game. So it's stuff that that is something you're going to want to do there with it, just so that everything doesn't feel exactly the same. That's sort of the big main downside for if you are using a template there. But otherwise, you've got a setup there where you've got timelines for entry and exit into the level, for transitions there for managing those. So those currently don't do too much. They're mostly doing a little bit of a fade, and they're also telling the character controller so that we're switching input off and on there. But that gives us something where we can be very quickly getting up and running. We've got the core infrastructure there, and then our focus is on our actual project, and in terms of the existing UI, and on updating that to make that look the way that we want it to. So it speeds up our getting up and running, and that's really the big goal with the templates. You might also want to construct your own template. So if you want to use this for a bit, or you could then also use it for a bit and then afterwards construct your own template. If you're constructing your own template, a way to work out what to include in that is start to look at what are the common things that you are finding you're needing to be doing. In particular, if there's common things you're forgetting. Part of the reason I set up this template was because I kept forgetting about adding into the budget, the planning of setting up menus and things like that, and I kept underestimating how long it would take. So I set up the template in part as a way to directly address that, so that I couldn't forget them because I already had them. So you can look at things that you commonly forget, make sure those are in there, look at things that you commonly use, and it's okay if the template has a bit more in it than you actually need, because it's very easy to select stuff and remove it. So you can always thin things out there, but having that template built up can really save a lot of time. It lowers that barrier of entry of starting a new project, and it means that there's less chance of you forgetting stuff. It means you're also not constantly reinventing the wheel. I implemented menu systems dozens and dozens of different times before finally implementing just one version. and then being able to stick with that so that I don't have to constantly keep reinventing the wheel. Same with the character motor. It's something that I've continually evolved and added to over time, and that way then it's something that you have, it's more robust and more reliable because you're using it more, and you're able to make fixes to it. When you make fixes, you fold them back into the main template. And that's what I often do. Anytime I work on a project, I usually will find things that I add or adjust in the template. And when I do that, I then go and add them back into that template so that they're available, so that next time around, that thing is just there as part of the default. So it gives you not just a starter to speed up your developing of the projects, but a continually improving starter that means it's going to be saving you more and more time as you're working on the projects. So that's really, really helpful. It's all about making it easier and letting us focus on making the game rather than infrastructure stuff that we might still need for the game, but that can really sort of slow things down or that we can forget. That's really the goal with it. Thanks, folks. I hope you found the video interesting and helpful. If you have, chuck in a like and subscribe. It really helps out. Really appreciate it. If you've got any questions, chuck in a comment below. And if you're looking for the code for the project, the code is available up on GitHub, and I've put the description to that in the link below. Now, with the code, it does include some third-party ones there, and with those, I've included the licenses or put the acknowledgements there, and the code is appropriate. Please make sure if you're using this in your own, if you're creating your own templates, please do include those, because those are sections there where those aren't things that I've written, and I think it's important to make sure that acknowledging the work there for those people that have actually done that and giving them the credit for that work, because it's not stuff I've built in some cases, and those things have been super helpful, super awesome, and I'm really thankful to those people for having written that. So do make sure you preserve that credit there for them. And if you're looking for other ways to support the channel, I do have a Patreon, and there is a link to that in the description below as well. But until next time, bye.